Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his face with his old cowboy hat. The Arizona sun was beating down hard that afternoon. It was the kind of heat that made the air dance and shimmer like water above the dry ground. Jake had been riding his horse for 3 hours, checking the fence lines around his family ranch. The Morrison Ranch had been in his family for over 60 years. His grandfather started it with nothing but hard work and a dream. Now Jake ran the place with his 2 sons and a handful of ranch hands. It was not easy work, but it was good work. The kind that made a man proud at the end of each day. Jake was 45 years old and had spent most of his life on horseback. His hands were rough from years of fixing fences and handling cattle. His face was brown from the sun, with lines around his eyes from squinting in the bright desert light. He knew every hill and valley on his land, or so he thought that day. Started like any other. Jake rode out early in the morning to check on his cattle. The ranch covered thousands of acres of desert land in eastern Arizona. Most days, the cattle stayed near the water sources close to the main buildings. But sometimes they wandered off looking for better grass or cooler spots to rest. When Jake reached the eastern fence line, he saw something that made him frown. Several posts were broken, and the wire was hanging loose. This was strange because he had checked this fence just 2 weeks ago, and everything was fine then. He got off his horse to look closer at the damage. The broken posts looked old, like they had been weak for some time. Jake shook his head. He would have to come back with tools and new posts to fix this properly. But first he needed to count his cattle and make sure none had wandered off through the broken fence. Jake climbed back on his horse and started counting the black and brown cattle scattered across the pasture. He had 43 head in this section. After counting twice, he came up with only 37. 6 cattle were missing. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. Losing cattle was serious business. Each cow was worth a lot of money his family needed to keep the ranch running. He had to find them fast, before they got too far away or into trouble. Looking at the ground near the broken fence, Jake found what he was looking for. Fresh hoof prints in the dusty soil showed which way the missing cattle had gone. The tracks led east, away from his land and into the rough desert country beyond. Jake had never ridden this far east before. This area was rocky and difficult, with steep hills and deep valleys. It was the kind of country that could hide cattle easily, but also the kind where a cow could get hurt or lost forever. The tracks were easy to follow at first. The soft sand between the rocks held the hoof prints clearly. Jake pushed his horse harder, hoping to catch up with the wandering cattle before they got too far away. The sun was getting higher, and the heat was becoming dangerous for both him and his horse. After riding for almost an hour, Jake reached the top of a rocky ridge. He stopped to let his horse rest and to look around for any sign of his cattle. The view from the ridge was amazing. He could see for miles in every direction. The desert stretched out like a brown and gold carpet, broken by red rock formations and green patches where water collected. Jake had lived in Arizona his whole life, but he had never seen this part of the country before. It was wild and beautiful, but also harsh and unforgiving. A man could die out here if he was not careful. As Jake looked around, something caught his eye in the valley below. There was a thin line of smoke rising from behind some large rocks. At first, Jake thought it might be a brush fire, which would be very dangerous in this dry country. But the smoke was too thin and steady. Someone had made a campfire down there. Jake felt his heart start to beat faster. Who would be camping out here in the middle of nowhere? This was miles from any road or town. The only people who came to places like this were people who did not want to be found. Maybe rustlers who had stolen his cattle. Jake reached for the rifle in his saddle holster and checked to make sure it was loaded. He had never shot at another person, but he would protect his property if he had to. Those cattle represented months of hard work and money his family could not afford to lose. Moving carefully down the rocky slope, Jake tried to stay hidden behind the large boulders. His horse was sure-footed, but the loose rocks made every step dangerous. One wrong move could send both horse and rider tumbling down the steep hillside. As Jake got closer to the smoke, he began to hear a strange sound. It was not talking or shouting like he expected from cattle thieves. It sounded almost like singing, but in a language he did not understand. The voice was old and rough, like someone who had lived a very long life. Jake tied his horse to a sturdy bush and crept forward on foot. He wanted to see what was happening before he decided what to do. Moving from rock to rock, he got close enough to see around a large boulder into a small clearing. What Jake saw made him stop and stare in complete surprise. An old man sat cross-legged beside a small fire. The man looked to be at least 80 years old, with long silver-gray hair braided down his back. His skin was dark and deeply lined from many years in the sun. He wore a mixture of traditional Native American clothing and modern ranch clothes. A leather vest with beadwork covered a plain cotton shirt, and his old cowboy boots were worn smooth from decades of use. But what really shocked Jake was what he saw beyond the old man. In a hidden valley just past the clearing, Jake's missing, cattle were grazing peacefully beside a spring of clear water. The cattle looked calm and well-fed, not like animals that had been driven hard by thieves. The old man seemed to sense Jake's presence. Without turning around, he spoke in clear English with a slight accent. "Your cattle were thirsty," the old man said calmly. "I brought them to water. They are safe." Jake did not know what to say. He had expected to find cattle thieves or wild animals. Instead, he found an elderly Native American man who seemed to be taking care of his missing livestock. Jake stepped out from behind the boulder. His hand still near his rifle, but no longer gripping it tightly. The old man turned slowly to look at Jake. His eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with a kind of wisdom that comes only from living a very long life. There was no fear in those eyes, only curiosity and perhaps a little amusement. "You followed them far from home," the old man said, nodding toward the cattle. "Good. A rancher should know where his animals go." Jake found his voice at last. "Who are you? And why did you bring my cattle here?" The old man smiled slightly. "I am Thomas Begay, and I did not bring your cattle anywhere. They came looking for water. I simply made sure they found it safely." Jake stared at the old man for a long moment. The name Thomas Begay sounded familiar, but he could not remember where he had heard it before. Jake slowly let his hand fall away from his rifle. Something about this elderly man made him feel like violence would be wrong, even foolish. "I know that name," Jake said carefully. "People in town talk about you sometimes." Thomas nodded and gestured for Jake to sit down near the fire. "I am sure they do. Old Apache medicine man who lives on the reservation. Some say I'm wise, others say I'm just old and stubborn." Jake hesitated for a moment, then sat down across the fire from Thomas. The heat felt good despite the warm day. There was something calming about sitting around a fire, even in the desert. It made talking easier somehow. "How did you know these were my cattle?" Jake asked. Thomas pointed to a brand on the nearest cow. "Morrison Ranch, I know this mark." "Your grandfather used the same brand many years ago? You knew my grandfather?" Jake asked, surprised. "Oh yes," Thomas said, his old eyes lighting up with memory. "Robert Morrison was a good man. We spoke many times over the years. He understood things that most white ranchers did not understand." Jake felt confused. His grandfather had never mentioned knowing any Apache people. In fact, Jake had grown up hearing stories about conflicts between ranchers and Native Americans. In the old days, his grandfather always said those days were best forgotten. What kind of things did he understand? Jake asked. Thomas picked up a stick and poked at the fire. Sparks flew up into the clear blue sky. "He understood that this land does not belong to anyone. We are all just taking care of it for the people who come after us." Thomas stood up slowly, his old joints creaking like old leather. He walked over to the spring where Jake's cattle were drinking. The water was crystal clear and bubbled up from deep underground. Jake had never known this spring existed, even though it was not far from his ranch. "Your grandfather brought me here once," Thomas said. "It was during a very dry year. His cattle were dying of thirst and his wells were going dry. I showed him this place, and his cattle lived through that terrible summer." Jake walked over to join Thomas beside the spring. The water was cold and sweet when he cupped some in his hands to drink. It was the best water he had ever tasted. Why would you help him? Jake asked. I thought ranchers and Apache people were enemies back then. Thomas sat down on a flat rock beside the spring. Some were enemies, yes. There was much fighting and much hate, but your grandfather was different. He came to the reservation one day, alone and unarmed. He wanted to talk. Thomas closed his eyes as if he was seeing something from long ago. That was 1962. There had been trouble between some ranchers and some young Apache men. Cattle had been stolen. Fences had been cut. Everyone was angry and ready to fight. Jake sat down on another rock and listened carefully. He had never heard this story before. Your grandfather came to see my father, who was chief then, Thomas continued. He said he did not want trouble. He said the land was big enough for everyone if people were willing to share and respect each other. What happened? Jake asked. My father and your grandfather made an agreement. The Apache would not bother Morrison Ranch cattle, and your grandfather would let our people gather plants and visit sacred places on his land. It was a good agreement. It kept peace for many years. Thomas opened his eyes and looked directly at Jake. But when your grandfather died, that agreement died with him. Your father did not know about it. The understanding was lost. Jake felt a strange sadness hearing this. His father had run the ranch for 15 years before Jake took over. His father was a good man, but he had always been suspicious of outsiders. He probably would not have honored an agreement he knew nothing about. Tell me about these sacred places, Jake said. Thomas stood up again and pointed to a hill about half a mile away. To Jake, it looked like any other hill covered with rocks and desert plants. But when Thomas spoke about it, Jake could hear the respect in his voice. That hill holds the bones of my great-grandfather and many others who came. It is a place where Apache people have come to pray and seek wisdom for hundreds of years. The spirits of our ancestors watch over this whole valley. Jake looked around the valley with new eyes. It was beautiful in a harsh way, but he had never thought of it as a sacred place. To him, it was just empty land that was too rough for cattle. Most of the time, are there other sacred places on my ranch? Jake asked. Several, Thomas said. But they have been forgotten by most people. Even many Apache young people do not know about them anymore. The old ways are disappearing. Thomas walked back to the fire and sat down again. He picked up a leather pouch from beside his blanket and pulled out some kind of dried plant. He threw a pinch of it into the fire, and a sweet smell filled the air. Why are you here today? Jake asked. Were you looking for my cattle? Thomas shook his head. I come here often. This is where I feel closest to my grandfather and great-grandfather. They taught me the old ways in this place when I was just a boy. How old are you? Jake asked. 85 years old. I have seen many changes in this country. When I was young, there were still Apache people who remembered the time before white. Men came. Now most of that knowledge is gone. Thomas looked sad as he said this. Jake could see the weight of all those years in the old man's face. What was it like when you were young? Jake asked. Hard, Thomas said simply. My people were forced to live on the reservation. We were not allowed to practice our religion or speak our language in school. Many children were taken away from their families and sent to boarding schools far away. Jake felt uncomfortable hearing this. He had never thought much about what life was like for Native American people. He just knew they lived on the reservation and mostly kept to themselves. But there were good times too, Thomas continued, his face brightening a little. My grandfather taught me to read the signs in nature, how to find water in the desert, how to track animals, how to understand what the weather would do by watching the clouds and feeling the wind. Thomas pointed to Jake's cattle, which were now lying in the shade of some large rocks. Your animals know these things too. They found this water because they could smell it from far away. Animals are smarter than people sometimes, Jake laughed. My grandfather used to say something like that. He said cattle had more sense than most cowboys. Your grandfather was a wise man, Thomas said. He listened to the land instead of just trying to control it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cattle rest in the shade. Jake was surprised at how peaceful he felt. When he first saw Thomas, He had been ready for trouble. Now he felt like he was talking to an old friend. "The land is changing," Thomas said suddenly. "I have watched it for many years. There is less rain now. The grass does not grow as thick as it used to. Some plants that my people have used for medicine are becoming hard to find?" Jake nodded. He had noticed the same things on his ranch. The last few years had been very dry. He had to dig deeper wells and move cattle more often to find good grazing. "What do you think is causing it?" Jake asked. Thomas was quiet for a long time before answering. "Too many cattle in some places. Not enough rest for the grass, and the weather is changing. My grandfather predicted this would happen." "Your grandfather predicted climate change?" Jake asked, surprised. "He said when people stopped listening to the land and started thinking they could control everything, the land would start to fight back. He said the rain would become less reliable and the seasons would change." Jake thought about this. His own ranch had been struggling with these exact problems. Maybe there was wisdom in the old Apache ways that could help modern ranchers. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and Jake knew he should start thinking about heading home. But he did not want this conversation to end. He was learning things about his land and his family that he had never known before. Jake was so interested in Thomas's stories that he lost track of time completely. The old Apache man had a way of talking that made everything seem important and meaningful. Jake felt like he was learning secrets about his own land that he should have known all his life. "Tell me more about my grandfather," Jake said. "What other things did you and he talk about?" Thomas smiled and was about to answer when a sound made both men turn their heads. In the distance, they could hear the thunder of horses running hard across the rocky ground. The sound was getting louder quickly. Jake felt his heart start to race. He jumped to his feet and looked toward the sound. Through the heat waves rising from the desert floor, he could see a cloud of dust moving toward them fast. Inside that cloud, he could make out several riders on horseback. "Who is that?" Jake asked, his hand moving automatically toward his rifle. Again, Thomas remained sitting by the fire, completely calm. "My son," he said simply. "And probably some others from our family." Jake felt a chill run down his back despite the heat. "Your son? How many others?" "Hard to say," Thomas said, still not looking worried. "David does not like it when I come out here alone. He thinks I am too old to be wandering around the desert by myself." The thunder of hooves was getting closer. Jake could now see that there were many riders, maybe 8 or 10. They were riding hard and fast, like men who expected trouble. Jake realized that he had been talking with Thomas for almost 30 minutes. To anyone looking for the old man, it might look like Jake was holding him against his will. "Thomas," Jake said urgently, "this could look bad. Me with a rifle, you out here alone, my cattle nearby. Your son might think I forced you to bring my cattle here." For the first time, Thomas looked a little concerned. "You are right. David can be very protective. And some of the young men with him have hot tempers." The riders were close enough now that Jake could see them clearly. The man in front was obviously Thomas's son. He had the same intelligent eyes and the same proud way of sitting on a horse. But his face looked angry and worried. Behind him rode 8 other Apache men, ranging from teenagers to men in their 40s. They all looked serious and ready for trouble. Jake's mouth went dry. He was one man with one rifle, facing 9 Apache riders who probably thought he was threatening their elder. This was exactly the kind of situation that could turn violent very quickly. "What should I do?" Jake asked Thomas. "Stay calm," Thomas said, finally standing up. "Let me talk first. Do not reach for your gun unless I tell you to." The riders came thundering into the clearing, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. The man in front, who had to be David Bege, jumped down from his horse before it had even stopped moving. His eyes went first to his father, checking to make sure he was unharmed, then to Jake with a look that was not friendly. "Father," David said in English, but with an edge in his voice. "Are you all right?" "I am fine, son," Thomas said calmly. "This is Jake Morrison. We have been having a good talk." David looked Jake up and down, taking in the rifle, the cowboy clothes, and the Morrison Ranch brand on the cattle nearby. "Morrison," "Ranch," he said. "We got word that someone was on our traditional lands with cattle." The ranch hands at Morrison said their boss had been gone for hours, following stolen cattle. Jake realized what had happened. His foreman, Carlos, must have noticed that Jake had been gone longer than usual. When Carlos found the broken fence and the cattle tracks leading off Morrison land, he probably got worried. Carlos knew that Jake never went into the rough country to the east. If Carlos had called around looking for information, word might have gotten to the reservation that there was trouble. "I was not stolen," Jake said carefully. "My cattle wandered off through a broken fence. Your father found them and made sure they had water." David's eyes narrowed. "My father is 85 years old. He should not be out here alone dealing with stray cattle and armed ranchers." One of the younger men behind David spoke up angrily. "Maybe this cowboy forced grandfather to help him find his cattle. Maybe he threatened him." Jake felt the situation getting more dangerous by the second. The young Apache men looked ready to fight. Some of them had rifles of their own, and all of them looked like they knew how to use them. "Nobody forced anybody to do anything," Thomas said firmly, using the tone of voice that comes with age and authority. "Jake Morrison and I met by accident. We have been talking about his grandfather and the old agreements between our families." "What old agreements?" David asked, looking confused. Thomas quickly told his son about the arrangement between Jake's grandfather and David's grandfather many years ago. As Thomas spoke, Jake could see David's expression change from suspicion to surprise to something that might have been respect, but before David could respond, another sound filled the air. More horses were coming, this time from the west. Jake's heart sank as he recognized the sound of his own ranch horses. His men were coming to look for him, probably armed and expecting trouble. "Oh no," Jake said under his breath. David heard. "The new horses too?" His face got hard again and he signaled to his men. The Apache riders spread out in a semicircle, facing the direction of the approaching sound. They were getting ready for a fight. "How many men do you have coming?" David asked Jake sharply. "I do not know," Jake said honestly. "Maybe 4 or 5. My foreman and some of the ranch hands, are they armed?" "Probably," Jake admitted. "If they think I am in trouble, they will come ready for anything." David cursed quietly in Apache, then in English. "This is exactly what we do not need." Armed cowboys and Apache men facing each other over a misunderstanding. Through the dust cloud approaching from the west, Jake could now see his men. Carlos, his foreman, was in the lead, along with Tom and Billy, 2 of his best ranch hands. Behind them rode 2 more men that Jake did not recognize right away. They were probably neighbors who had joined the search. When they heard about missing cattle and a missing rancher, all of Jake's men were carrying rifles and they were riding hard. When they saw the Apache riders spread out in fighting formation, they slowed down but did not stop. Carlos raised his hand to signal the others to spread out. Jake found himself standing between 2 groups of armed men who were ready to fight each other. On one side, 9 Apache men who thought they were protecting their elder from a dangerous rancher. On the other side, 5 cowboys who thought they were rescuing their boss from hostile Indians. "This is bad," David said quietly. "Very bad, Jake," agreed. Thomas stepped forward, putting himself between his son and Jake. "Both of you listen to me," he said in a voice that demanded attention. "I am too old to watch young men fight over nothing. There will be no shooting today." "Father," David sighed, "these men are armed and—" "So are you," Thomas interrupted. "So is everyone here. That does not mean anyone has to use their weapons." Jake's men were now close enough that Carlos could see Jake standing unharmed beside the fire. Carlos held up his hand to stop the other riders about 50 yards away. "Boss!" Carlos called out. "You all right?" "I am fine, Carlos," Jake called back. "Everything is okay here." But Jake could see that Carlos was not convinced. The foreman's eyes kept moving from Jake to the Apache riders who were still spread out in battle formation. Carlos had been with the Morrison Ranch for 20 years. He had seen range wars and cattle rustling. He knew how quickly peaceful situations could turn deadly. "Who are these men, boss?" Carlos asked, not lowering his rifle. "This is Thomas Begay and his son David," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Thomas found our missing cattle and made sure they were safe." Jake could see the confusion on Carlos's face. Like most people in the area, Carlos knew stories about Thomas Begay, but he had never met the old medicine man. Carlos also knew the history of conflicts between ranchers and Apache people. He was probably wondering if this was some kind of trap. David was having the same problem with his own men. The younger Apache riders were getting restless. They had come expecting to rescue their elder from danger, and now they were facing armed cowboys. Some of them were probably remembering old stories about fights between their people and white. Ranchers. Jake realized that both groups were one misunderstanding away from a shooting fight that would destroy any chance of peace between their communities. He had to do something, and he had to do it quickly. "Carlos," Jake called out, "I need you to trust me. These men are not our enemies. Lower your rifle and tell the others to do the same." Carlos hesitated. "Boss, I do not like this. There are too many of them, and we are too far from help." "Carlos," Jake said firmly, "I am ordering you to lower your weapon, now." After a long moment, Carlos slowly lowered his rifle. The other ranch hands followed his example, but Jake could see they were still ready to fight if anything went wrong. Jake took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the middle of the open space between the two groups of armed men. His heart was beating fast, but he forced himself to move calmly and keep his hands visible and away from his weapon. "David," Jake said, looking at Thomas's son, "will you tell your men to lower their rifles too?" David looked at his father, who nodded slightly. Then David spoke quickly in Apache to his men. One by one, they lowered their weapons, but Jake could see they were still ready to use them if needed. The tension in the air was so thick, Jake felt like he could cut it with a knife. One wrong word or sudden movement could start a fight that would end with good men dead on both sides. Jake had never been so scared in his life, but he had never felt more responsible either. "Carlos," Jake called to his foreman, "bring the men up here, but slowly. These people are friends, not enemies." Carlos looked doubtful, but he trusted Jake. He signaled to the other ranch hands, and they rode forward carefully, keeping their rifles lowered but ready. When they were about 20 feet away, Carlos dismounted and walked the rest of the way on foot. "Boss," Carlos said quietly when he reached Jake, "what is going on here?" "We found the broken fence and followed your tracks. When we could not find you, we got worried. Then someone said there might be trouble on tribal land." "Who said that?" Jake asked. "Tom Jenkins from the Bartee Ranch. He heard radio chatter about missing cattle and a missing rancher. He thought there might be rustlers working the area." Jake cursed under his breath. Tom Jenkins was a good neighbor, but he was also the kind of man who saw trouble everywhere he looked. If Tom had heard about the situation and decided it was rustlers or hostile Indians, he might have called other ranchers for help. That could mean more armed men were on their way. "Carlos," Jake said urgently, "did Tom call anyone else?" "I think so, boss. He said he was going to contact the sheriff and maybe some of the other ranchers. He thought we might need backup if there was serious trouble." Jake's heart sank. Sheriff Pete Morrison was Jake's cousin, and he was a good lawman, but he was also quick to assume the worst in situations like this. If Pete was coming with a posse of armed ranchers, the peaceful conversation Jake had been having with Thomas could turn into a war. David heard this conversation and moved closer to Jake. "How many more men might be coming?" he asked. "I do not know," Jake said honestly. "Maybe none, maybe a lot. It depends on how scared people got and how many were available to ride out here. This is getting out of hand," David said. "We should leave before more people arrive." "Wait," Thomas said, speaking for the first time since the two groups had faced off. "Running away will not solve anything. It will just make people more suspicious and more likely to fight the next time something like this happens." The old Apache man walked slowly toward Carlos, who stiffened as Thomas approached. "You are the Morrison Ranch foreman," Thomas said. "Your boss is a good man like his grandfather before him." Carlos looked confused. "You knew Jake's grandfather?" "Robert Morrison was my friend," Thomas said simply. "He understood that this land belongs to all of us. We made agreements that kept peace between our people for many years. Thomas turned to address both groups of men. Today, your boss and I met by accident. We talked about old times and old agreements. We found common ground and common problems. This could be the beginning of new understanding between our communities. One of the younger Apache men spoke up. Grandfather, these people have never shown respect for our land or our traditions. Why should we trust them now? Because, Thomas said patiently, holding on to old anger helps no one. Your children and their children will have to live in this country. Do you want them to inherit peace or endless conflict? Carlos stepped forward. Mr. Bege, I have heard good things about you from people in town, but some of my men are nervous. We have heard stories about cattle rustling and territory disputes. Can you blame us for being careful? No, Thomas said. And you cannot blame us for being protective of our elder when he is found alone with armed strangers. Jake could see that both Thomas and Carlos were trying to calm the situation, but the tension was still there. The younger men on both sides were looking for any excuse to prove they were brave and loyal to their groups. Listen, Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I know this looks bad from both sides, but nothing wrong has happened here. Thomas helped my cattle find water. We talked about our families and our land, that is all. Then why do we need all these guns? Asked Billy, one of Jake's ranch hands. Because people are scared, Jake said. Scared people make bad decisions. I do not want anyone to make a bad decision today. David spoke up. My father is right about the old agreements. But those agreements died with your grandfather. There has been no communication between our communities for years. People on both sides have forgotten how to trust each other. Maybe it is time to remember, Jake said, as if to prove Jake's point. The sound of more horses reached their ears. This time, the sound was coming from the south, and there were a lot of horses. Jake counted at least 6 riders, maybe more. Sheriff, Carlos said, recognizing the sound of law enforcement vehicles mixed with the horse hooves. And it sounds like he brought help. David quickly spoke to his men in Apache. They immediately began moving toward their horses, but not in a panicked way. They were preparing to leave, but they wanted to be ready for trouble if it came. David, wait, Jake said. If your people leave now, it will look like you were doing something wrong. The sheriff will want to know why you ran. And if we stay, he will want to know why we are here with weapons, David replied. Thomas raised his hand for quiet. Both of you are thinking like young men who want to fight or run. Think like older men who want to solve problems? The sound of approaching riders was getting closer. Through the dust, Jake could see the distinctive shape of Sheriff Pete Morrison's hat, along with several other men he recognized from town and neighboring ranches. Jake, Thomas said quietly, when your cousin arrives, he will want to take control of this situation. He will want to separate everyone and ask questions. That is his job. But it could also destroy the trust we have built here today. What do you suggest? Jake asked. Tell him the truth, but tell it together. Show him that we are not enemies. Show him that we solved our own problem without violence. David nodded slowly. My father is right. If we act like partners instead of opponents, maybe your sheriff will see that this is not a crisis. Jake looked around at all the armed men and wondered if that was possible. There were now over 15 people with weapons standing in a small desert valley. Any one of them could start a fight with a single wrong word or movement. Sheriff Pete Morrison rode into the clearing with 5 other men. Jake recognized Tom Jenkins from the Bartee Ranch, his neighbor Frank Wilson, and 3 men he did not know, but who looked like experienced cowboys. All of them were armed and looked ready for serious trouble. Pete dismounted quickly and walked straight toward Jake, his hand resting on his pistol. Jake, are you all right? We got reports of missing cattle and possible rustlers. I am fine. Pete, Jake said calmly, there are no rustlers. Just a misunderstanding that got bigger than it needed to be. Pete looked around at the Apache men, then at Jake's ranch hands, then at the cattle grazing peacefully by the spring. Explain to me what is going on here. Jake took a deep breath. This was the moment when everything could go very right or very Wrong. He had to choose his words carefully and hope that everyone else would follow his lead. Pete, I want you to meet Thomas Begay and his son David. Thomas found my missing cattle and made sure they had water. We have been talking about ways our communities can work together instead of being suspicious of each other. Pete's eyes narrowed. Work together how? Before Jake could answer, Thomas stepped forward. Sheriff Morrison, your cousin and I have been discussing problems that affect both our communities. Drought, overgrazing, land management. These are not Apache problems or white problems. They are everyone's problems. Pete looked skeptical. And you need all these guns to discuss land management? David spoke up. We both came looking for people we care about. We both came prepared for trouble, but we found conversation instead of conflict. That is all well and good, said Tom Jenkins, riding up close enough to join the conversation. But why are there so many Apache men on ranch land, and why are they armed? Jake felt the tension rising again. Tom Jenkins was the kind of man who saw conspiracy everywhere and trusted no one who looked different from himself. If Tom started making accusations, the whole situation could explode. Thomas looked directly at Tom Jenkins with calm, steady eyes. We are on traditional Apache land, Mr. Jenkins. This valley has been sacred to my people for hundreds of years. The spring you see here has provided water for Apache families long before any ranch was built in this area. Tom's face got red. Sacred land or not, this is still Morrison Ranch property according to the legal boundaries. You cannot just come here with armed men whenever you want. Jake stepped between Tom and Thomas before the situation could get worse. Tom, nobody is trying to take anyone's land. We are trying to find ways to work together that help everyone. Work together how? Sheriff Pete asked again, his voice showing he was getting impatient with the vague answers. Jake looked at David, then at Thomas, then back at his cousin. Pete, what if I told you there was a way to solve the water problems that have been hurting ranchers for the past 3 years? What if there was a way to stop the overgrazing that is destroying the grass we all depend on? Pete raised an eyebrow. I would say you have my attention. Thomas stepped forward again. Sheriff, your cousin's grandfather and my father made agreements years ago that helped both communities survive during hard times. Those agreements were forgotten when the older generation died, but the problems they solved are still here. David pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. I have a degree in environmental science from Arizona State University. I have been studying land management techniques that could help both the reservation and the surrounding ranches deal with drought and overgrazing. Jake was surprised. Had not known that David was a college graduate with expertise in exactly the problems his ranch was facing. What kind of techniques? Frank Wilson asked. Frank was a practical man who cared more about solutions than politics. Rotational grazing systems, David said. Water conservation methods. Restoration of native plants that hold soil together and provide better nutrition for cattle. Some of these techniques are traditional Apache methods that my grandfather taught me. Others are modern scientific approaches. Carlos stepped forward. Boss, we have been talking about needing new approaches to the drought problems. Maybe we should listen to what they have to say. Tom Jenkins was not convinced. This all sounds nice, but I still do not understand why everyone needed to come out here armed like we are going to war. One of the younger Apache men, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Because that is what always happens when our people and your people meet. Someone gets suspicious, someone gets scared, and someone gets hurt. We came ready to protect our grandfather. You came ready to protect your friend? But maybe it is time to try something different. Jake could see that Sheriff Pete was thinking hard about the situation. Pete was a good lawman, but he was also a practical politician who knew that any violence between ranchers and Apache people would be very bad for everyone in the county. All right, Pete said finally. Here is what we are going to do. Everyone is going to put their weapons away. Then we are going to sit down like civilized people and figure out what kind of agreements might actually work. Pete, Tom Jenkins protested, you cannot just ignore the fact that these people came onto ranch land with weapons. Tom, Pete said firmly, These people were invited here by the cattle themselves, and Jake invited them to stay by sitting down and talking instead of shooting first and asking questions later. Now, either be part of the solution or ride back to town and let the adults handle this. Tom's face got even redder, but he did not say anything else. He knew better than to argue with Pete Morrison when the sheriff used that tone of voice. One by one, all the men put their rifles back in their saddle holsters or leaned them against rocks. The simple act of putting the weapons away seemed to make everyone breathe easier. Thomas sat back down by his fire and gestured for the others to join him. This is how problems should be solved, with words and open minds, not with fear and weapons. Jake sat down next to Thomas, and David sat on the other side of his father. Sheriff Pete sat across from them, and gradually the other men formed a loose circle around the fire. Now, Pete said, let us start from the beginning. Thomas, explain to me what you mean by traditional agreements? Thomas spent the next 20 minutes telling the whole group about the friendship between his father and Jake's grandfather. He explained how they had shared resources during droughts, how they had worked together to prevent conflicts between their communities, and how they had respected each other's sacred places and practical needs. When Thomas finished, Jake spoke. I never knew any of this. My grandfather never told me about these agreements. But it explains some things I always wondered about. What kind of things? David asked. Why my grandfather always warned us to stay away from certain areas on the ranch. Why he always seemed to know where to find water during dry years. Why he had such good relationships with people in town, even though other ranchers were always complaining about conflicts with the reservation. Carlos nodded. Your grandfather was known for being fair and peaceful. Other ranchers used to ask his advice when they had problems. Frank Wilson leaned forward. Thomas, you said your son has ideas about land management. What exactly are you proposing? David looked around the circle before answering. I am proposing that we create a formal partnership between Morrison Ranch and interested families from the reservation. We would share knowledge, share some resources, and work together on projects that help everyone. What kind of projects? Sheriff Pete asked. Water conservation and development, David said. Restoration of native grasses that are better for cattle and better for the soil. Rotational grazing systems that prevent overuse of any one area. Maybe even some ecotourism projects that could bring outside money into both communities. Tom Jenkins shook his head. It sounds complicated and risky. What happens when there are disagreements? What happens if the partnership fails? Thomas smiled. Mr. Jenkins, what happens if we keep doing what we have been doing? More drought, more conflict, more suspicious neighbors pointing guns at each other over misunderstandings. Thomas is right, Jake said. The old ways are not working. We need to try something new. Sheriff Pete stood up and walked over to the spring where Jake's cattle were still drinking. This water source could solve a lot of problems for ranchers in this area. Thomas, would your people be willing to share access to it? Under the right agreements, yes, Thomas said. But it would have to be managed carefully. This is a sacred place as well as a practical resource. What would the right agreements look like? Pete asked. David and Jake looked at each other. Jake could see that David was thinking the same thing he was thinking. This could be the beginning of something important, but it would take careful planning and a lot of trust. I think, Jake said slowly, we need to start small. Maybe David and I could work together on 1 or 2 projects. See how it goes, build trust gradually. What kind of projects? Carlos asked. David pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. I have been studying the erosion problems on the hills east of Morrison Ranch. I think I know how to fix them using a combination of traditional Apache techniques and modern conservation methods. If it works, it would benefit both the ranch and the sacred sites on those hills. Jake felt excited. The erosion has been getting worse every year. If you really think you can fix it, I am willing to try. Thomas stood up slowly, his old joints creaking. This is how it should be. Young men working together to solve problems. Old men providing wisdom and guidance, communities supporting each other instead of fearing each other. Sheriff Pete nodded. I like this direction. But I want regular reports on how things are going. And I want both communities to know that my office will support peaceful cooperation but will not tolerate any return to the old conflicts. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in brilliant colors, the group started to break up. But instead of the suspicious, hostile separation that had seemed likely an hour ago, men from both sides were talking quietly about practical details and future possibilities. Tom Jenkins was still skeptical, but even he seemed interested in David's ideas about erosion control. If you can really stop that erosion on the north pasture, it would save me thousands of dollars in lost topsoil every year. Jake's cattle had been resting comfortably all afternoon, and now they were ready to head home. As the men prepared to leave, Jake realized that this day had changed something fundamental in his understanding of his land and his community. "Thomas," Jake said as they prepared to part ways, "would you be willing to come to the ranch house sometime? I have my grandfather's old journals in a trunk in the attic. Maybe they contain information about the agreements you talked about." Thomas's eyes lit up. "I would be honored to see those journals. And I have some things that belong to my father that might interest you." David and Jake exchanged contact information and made plans to meet the following week to look at the erosion problems. David had mentioned Carlos volunteered to help with any projects that might benefit the ranch. As the two groups rode away in different directions, Jake felt something he had not felt in years: hope that the problems facing his ranch and his community were not impossible to solve.